novel by Opemipo. The night Stephanie Douglas was born, the elders said the earth did not sleep. They said the wind moved differently, slow, deliberate, as though carrying a message it was unsure how to deliver. The moon sat low, swollen and coppered, hovering over the red soil of the Douglas kingdom, like an eye that refused to close. By morning, the midwives whispered among themselves. By evening, the diviners had been summoned. Stephanie arrived first, silent but alert, her eyes opening too soon, too knowingly. She did not cry immediately. She watched. Her skin carried the warmth of the land, her fingers curling instinctively as though grasping something unseen. Angela followed less than 2 hours later, loud, defiant, announcing herself with a cry that split the air and startled the women holding her. Where Stephanie was composed, Angela was flame. Where one inhaled the world, the other demanded it answer back. Twin spirits born of different temperaments. 2 daughters to King Douglas and his Lolo. Gifts wrapped in prophecy. They will not walk the same path. The eldest diviner warned softly, drawing symbols into ash. But their shadows will always touch. The king listened. He always did. They grew as opposites, shaped by the same love. Stephanie learned stillness early. She watched people before speaking, absorbed silence like scripture. She loved books, shadows, the calm certainty of order. When she walked, she carried herself like someone aware that eyes followed her, even when none did. Angela learned movement. Laughter came easily to her. She spoke with her hands, danced with her feet, loved loudly and without apology. Where Stephanie retreated inward, Angela reached outward. And yet, when night came, they shared the same mat, whispering dreams into darkness, their hands finding each other instinctively. They were never apart long enough to forget they were one story written in 2 inks. The Audiobolks were spoken of long before they were seen. A powerful lineage, well-tempered by discipline. A family whose name carried both respect and fear. When word arrived that the Audiobolks sought union with the Douglas throne, the palace did not erupt in celebration. It went quiet. Thomasin Audiobolks was first mentioned, head of the family. Calculated, controlled. A man whose silence commanded attention. It was said he did not waste words or emotion. What he chose fully. Tomiwa Audiobolks followed his name like a rumor, celebrity, charisma, laughter that disarmed. A man adored by crowds, effortless in charm, dangerous in appeal. Where Thomasin was stone, Tomiwa was firelight. The elders approved the matches. The ancestors did not object. That should have been enough. Stephanie met Thomasin beneath the Iroko tree. Their greeting was formal, their conversation measured. But when their eyes met, something ancient shifted. Not warmth, recognition. As though 2 people aware of responsibility were acknowledging the weight they would now carry together. Angela met Tomiwa in the courtyard. He smiled. She laughed. Sparks flew without permission. The kingdom rejoiced. The sisters prepared. No one noticed the silence that lingered beneath celebration. No one asked the earth whether it agreed. On the night of the weddings, tradition guided every step. Palm wine flowed, drums spoke, songs rose and fell like prayer. The sisters were adorned differently. Stephanie in deep ivory and gold. Angela in red threaded with coral. Their veils fell like separate destinies. Their hands trembled for reasons no one named. The rooms were prepared carefully, but destiny, it seemed, was careless. A corridor, a door. A moment of distraction, and the ancestors, watching. When dawn broke, the mistake had already settled into the bones of the house. Stephanie woke with a stillness she did not recognize. Angela woke with a silence she had never known. Across the palace, Thomasin stood at the window, jaw clenched, eyes distant. "What is done," he said finally, voice firm as law, "is done." The earth did not argue. And somewhere beneath the palace stones, something old stirred. Morning did not arrive gently. It crept into the palace on cautious feet, as though aware it was unwelcome. Sunlight slipped through carved windows and lay thinly across the floors, illuminating nothing it could explain. Stephanie was already awake. She sat upright on the edge of the bed, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap as if in prayer, though she was not praying. Her thoughts moved too deliberately for that. Prayer required surrender. What filled her chest was reckoning. The room still carried the night, the faint warmth of another body, the lingering hush of breath not her own. She did not turn to look. She already knew what she would see, and knowledge this morning was heavier than sight. Across the corridor, Angela woke with a sharp inhale, as though pulled suddenly from deep water. Her hand flew to her mouth. The room was unfamiliar in ways she could not immediately place. Its scent, its stillness, the way the curtains fell. Then memory struck. Not all at once, not mercifully. Fragments surfaced. Laughter cut short, a door closing, a name spoken too late. A touch she had not questioned until it was already answering her. Angela sat up, heart racing, eyes wide. "No," she whispered, though the word had no one to convince. Breakfast was announced by the maidservants with practiced calm. Trays were prepared. Footsteps moved quietly through the corridors. The palace functioned as it always had, indifferent to the fact that something within its walls had shifted. Stephanie dressed carefully. She chose restraint over beauty, structure over softness. Every movement was controlled, as though she were holding herself together with discipline alone. When she finally stepped into the corridor, she paused. Angela stood there already. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. They did not embrace. They did not accuse. What lived between them was too complex for either. Sisterhood did not dissolve, but it bent, strained under the weight of something neither had chosen. Angela looked away first. Thomason descended the staircase like a verdict. He was already composed, already armored. His face revealed nothing, but his presence filled the room, pressing silence from every corner. Tomiwa followed more slowly. His usual ease dulled, laughter absent. The four of them gathered around the breakfast table, like strangers who shared a secret too large to speak aloud. Plates were set, cups poured, no one ate. It was Thomason who broke the quiet. "What has happened?" he said evenly. "Cannot be undone." Angela's fingers tightened around her cup. Stephanie inhaled slowly. "We will not invite chaos," Thomason continued. "Not in our homes, not in our bloodlines. What the night has sealed, the morning will not unseal." His gaze moved. Not accusatory, not tender, but resolute. "This marriage stands." The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Tomiwa swallowed, nodding once. He did not speak, but something flickered behind his eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or a grief he did not yet understand. The sisters remained silent. They had been raised to respect authority, but they had also been raised to listen, to the body, to the spirit, to the quiet voice beneath ceremony. And that voice was restless. By midday, the palace had returned to movement. Responsibilities called, duties resumed. The kingdom did not pause for private fractures. Stephanie retreated into order. Meetings, correspondence, ritual observances. She did everything correctly, flawlessly, as though precision might erase memory. Angela threw herself into motion. Training sessions, laughter forced too bright, conversation that never quite reached her eyes. And beneath it all, something unfamiliar grew. Not desire, not regret. Awareness. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the palace walls, the sisters crossed paths again. This time, Angela reached out. "Steph," she said softly. Stephanie stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. "We didn't plan this," Angela said. "No," Stephanie replied, "but we are living it." Their hands found each other then, not in comfort, but in recognition. Two women standing at the edge of something unnamed. Above them, the moon began to rise, and the ancestors, patient as ever, waited. The palace was old enough to remember silence. Its walls were thick with memory, layered with breath and footfall, laughter and grief. Stone did not forget. Wood did not forgive. The corridors had carried whispered confessions long before these four had ever learned to speak their own truths. It had watched generations rise in celebration and collapse in quiet ruin. It had absorbed secrets without judgment. But now it listened differently, as though something within it had been awakened. The air itself felt aware. Stephanie felt it first. She paused in the inner corridor that led to the women's chambers, her fingertips grazing the carved wooden panels that lined the walls. The carvings told stories, battles won, vows made, unions sealed beneath ancestral blessing. Her touch traced one pattern absently, and for a fleeting second, she felt as though the wood held warmth beneath her palm. The air there was cooler than elsewhere in the palace, heavier. It pressed against her skin with deliberate weight, carrying a presence she could not name. The palace, she thought, was listening. The notion unsettled her, not because she believed it literally, but because it felt true in ways logic could not dismiss. The house had always felt protective, structured, contained. Now it felt observant. She withdrew her hands slowly and continued walking, her posture straight, her expression measured. Yet the sensation followed her, an awareness that her steps were being counted, her silences measured, her restraint cataloged. Even the echo of her heels seemed louder than usual. Angela, meanwhile, sought refuge in noise. She laughed with the maids in the dressing hall, her voice ringing bright against marble walls. She teased them about misplaced fabrics, complimented braids too dramatically, accepted gossip she barely absorbed. Movement surrounded her, voices overlapped, sound drowned thought. Still, every pause felt weighted. Every lull between sentences pulled her backward, toward memory, toward the night, toward that suspended moment at breakfast, where warmth and recognition had intertwined too easily to dismiss. It had not felt forbidden. It had felt familiar. That frightened her more. She sparred again in the courtyard, this time without intensity, only enough to maintain appearance. The guards laughed when she exaggerated a feint. She grinned back, deflecting attention, as she always had. But between movements, she sensed it. The palace adjusting, arranging. Her path intersected Tomiwa's near the West Wing corridor just before midday. Neither had intended it. Neither avoided it. They slowed simultaneously. "Angela," he said, nodding once. "Tomiwa." Nothing more. Yet the silence stretched, elastic, charged. Her pulse quickened, not wildly, not recklessly, but enough to remind her she was alive in a way she had not fully noticed before. His gaze flickered, curious, careful. Then footsteps approached from behind. A servant carrying linens. The moment dissolved. They moved on. The palace had allowed it just long enough. Thomason experienced the shift first as irritation. He noticed it in the servant's precision. Too precise. The way conversations faltered when he entered a room. The way even laughter seemed to modulate in his presence, as if the house itself were calibrating emotion. He disliked it. Order was stability. Structure prevented fracture. He had built his life on clarity, on roles defined and boundaries respected. Marriage, to him, was partnership grounded in trust and deliberate choice. Yet something about this place, this alignment of 4 lives beneath ancestral ceilings, resisted containment. He found Stephanie in the outer gallery mid-afternoon, reviewing correspondence. She looked composed, as always, but when she glanced up at him, her gaze did not carry softness or avoidance. It carried inquiry, measured, observant, as though she were studying not what he said, but what he withheld. He held her eyes for a fraction too long. "Is something troubling you?" he asked evenly. "No," she replied, equally calm. But the air between them said otherwise. He left unsettled. Tomiwa noticed the palace in subtler ways. The echo of his footsteps seemed delayed, as though the walls were responding rather than reflecting. Doors closed a heartbeat too late, hinges sighing softly after he passed. Even the hush that fell when Angela laughed carried a different tone now. Less carefree, more aware. He had lived his life in motion. Noise, admiration, momentum. Stillness was foreign territory, but now it wrapped around him, insistent, asking questions he had never needed to answer. At dusk, the light softened into amber and gold. Shadows lengthened across the gardens. He stood beneath the archway overlooking the inner courtyard and saw Angela there, alone near the fountain. She wasn't moving. That unsettled him more than if she had been sparring. She stood with her arms folded loosely, gaze distant. He did not approach. Neither did he turn away. They existed within the same frame of twilight, separated by stone and silence. The palace held its breath. That night, the house shifted. Not dramatically, not violently, but perceptibly. Drums sounded faintly from beyond the outer walls, too distant to belong to celebration, too steady to be coincidence, a rhythm older than the current generation. older than memory. Candles flickered along corridors, though no wind passed through open windows. Shadows stretched longer than their source permitted. Stephanie woke suddenly. Her heart pounded, though she could not recall the dream. Heat lingered along her skin, unfamiliar and disorienting. She sat upright, listening. The palace was quiet. Too quiet. Across the hall, Angela stirred at the exact same moment, breath catching in her throat. Neither knew the other was awake, but the house did. It shifted around them, wood creaking softly, as if adjusting its posture. Minutes passed, or perhaps seconds. Eventually, both rose from their beds without fully deciding to. Their steps carried them instinctively through dim corridors toward the inner courtyard, the one seldom used, where an old altar stood beneath open sky. It had been built generations ago, then gradually abandoned as rituals softened into symbolism. Tonight, it felt summoned. Stephanie arrived first. Angela entered seconds later. They stopped when they saw each other. The silence between them was not surprise. It was recognition. That this place, Angela whispered, her voice stripped of performance. It feels different. Stephanie nodded slowly, as though it remembers more than it should. They stepped closer to the altar but did not touch it. The stone was worn smooth by hands long gone. Vines curled along its edges, reclaiming what had been forgotten. "Do you think the ancestors are angry?" Angela asked quietly. The question lingered in the night air. Stephanie considered carefully. "No," she said at last. "I think they are watching." Angela's throat tightened slightly. "For what?" "For what we will choose." The word choose hung heavier than either expected. Above them, the stars burned steady and unblinking. The moon cast silver across the courtyard, illuminating the faint carvings along the altar's base. Symbols of union, of balance, of fate intertwined. A breeze passed through, though no leaves stirred elsewhere. The palace seemed to exhale, not in warning, not in approval, in patience, ancient and attentive. It did not interfere, it did not judge. It simply listened and waited. Morning arrived dressed in civility. The long dining table was prepared before any of them descended, polished mahogany gleaming beneath soft amber light. The chandelier above shimmered faintly refracting warmth across porcelain plates arranged with meticulous precision. Silverware aligned as though discipline alone could keep disorder at bay. Crystal glasses caught the light and fractured it into quiet rainbows along the table's spine. The maidservants moved like trained shadows, present, attentive, unobtrusive. Their uniforms were immaculate. Their steps were soundless. They had been taught to read posture, to interpret silence, to recognize the difference between tension and mere fatigue. Most importantly, they had been trained to forget what they noticed. Warm bread steamed gently within woven baskets, butter softened on delicate dishes. Slices of papaya, mango, and pear glistened with dew as if freshly lifted from the orchard. Teacups rested in precise symmetry, awaiting hands steady enough to lift them. The room was perfect. Too perfect. Stephanie arrived first. She did not rush. She never rushed. Her entrance carried the quiet authority of someone who understood that presence alone could alter a room's temperature. She wore composure the way others wore jewelry, deliberately, elegantly, with intention. Her dress fell in clean lines, understated but refined. Her hair was pinned back flawlessly. Her expression was serene. Only the slight pause before she took her seat betrayed the vigilance beneath her calm. She surveyed the table, not the food, not the settings, but the space itself. She measured the distance between chairs, the width of the table, the angles of sightlines, where glances might meet, where hands might accidentally brush. She sat. Angela followed moments later, sunlight clinging to her like an afterthought. She moved with natural ease, though something in her gait felt just a shade less certain than usual. Her dress was softer in tone, flowing where Stephanie's was structured. She smiled, bright, quick, automatic. Then she saw Stephanie, already seated. For the briefest second, her hand lifted to adjust her sleeve unnecessarily. A nervous gesture, uncharacteristic. Their eyes met. A flicker passed between them. Not accusation, not fear. Recognition. Angela held Stephanie's gaze just long enough to confirm that What she had felt yesterday had not been imagined. Stephanie's calm look returned the confirmation without drama. They sat. The air remained balanced, but barely. Thomason entered next. The room responded to him. It was subtle, but undeniable. His presence carried weight, not heavy, but anchored. He greeted them with a nod, measured and respectful, his voice low and steady. "Good morning." He took his place at the head of the table with natural authority. His cufflinks caught the light as he adjusted his sleeves. His posture was impeccable. Yet his gaze, as it settled briefly on Stephanie, lingered a fraction too long. Too brief to be intimacy. Too deliberate to be accidental. Stephanie lowered her eyes first. Not submissive, but strategic. Tomiwa arrived last. He paused at the threshold. It was almost imperceptible, that hesitation, but it existed. His eyes swept the table, as if assessing emotional terrain before stepping into it. When his gaze found Angela, something softened in his expression, an openness he did not entirely conceal before reshaping it into something lighter. "Good morning," he said, his tone easy, practiced. Angela returned the greeting. Her voice was warm, though quieter than usual. Not diminished, just thoughtful. He took his seat beside her. The geometry of the table was complete. Breakfast began. Bread was passed, butter spread, tea poured. The ritual of civility unfolded with seamless choreography. Polite conversation drifted across the table like harmless smoke. "How did you sleep?" Thomason asked calmly. "Well enough," Stephanie replied. Angela commented on the weather. Tomiwa responded with a light remark about upcoming engagements. Their words were structured, sensible, appropriate. None of them acknowledged the undercurrent threading through the room. Then it happened. Stephanie reached for the honey at the exact moment Thomason did. Neither anticipated the other. Their fingers brushed. It was not dramatic. It was not prolonged. But the contact was unmistakable. A spark, small, precise, traveled up Stephanie's arm and settled somewhere behind her ribs. Her breath caught, almost imperceptibly. She withdrew instantly, her composure snapping back into place like a well-practiced shield. "Apologies," she murmured, steady. Thomason's hand hovered for half a second longer than necessary. "Of course," he said. His tone was even. His eyes were not. Across the table, Angela was mid-laughter at something Tomiwa had just said, something trivial about a minor scheduling mishap. Her laughter rang bright, authentic. It was her strength, joy unfiltered. Tomiwa leaned in closer instinctively, drawn by it. His voice lowered as he added a quieter comment meant only for her. Their shoulders brushed. Angela inhaled sharply. The contact was brief, but it carried warmth. A heat that did not belong entirely to proximity. For one suspended heartbeat, the space between them closed enough to feel like something fragile and dangerous. Like the beginning of a promise neither had consciously made. Angela leaned back first. She smiled, too quickly. Silence followed. Not awkward, but thick. The kind of silence that stretches when everyone in a room senses something unnamed. The maidservants moved carefully as they refilled cups. One exchanged a fleeting glance with another. It was subtle, professional. They had seen tension before. They recognized this as something different, delicate. Angela leaned towards Stephanie, lowering her voice, just enough to avoid carrying across the table. "How do you cope with this?" she whispered, her tone half playful, half confessional. Stephanie did not respond immediately. She lifted her teacup, inhaled the steam, allowed herself a moment to steady her thoughts. "I breathe," she said finally. "And I remind myself that not everything that is felt must be followed." Angela's lips curved in reluctant admiration. "You've always been stronger than me." Stephanie's gaze shifted to her sister fully now. Not judgmental, not superior, intent. "Not stronger," she said gently. "Just quieter." Angela studied her for a moment, realizing the truth in it. Stephanie did not lack feeling. She simply housed it differently. Across the table, Tomiwa's eyes flickered toward Angela, as if sensing the shift in her mood. Thomason straightened slightly, noticing Stephanie's stillness. No one addressed it. Soon after, duty intervened. Thomason rose first, adjusting his cuffs with habitual precision. His chair slid back with quiet authority. "We have meetings to attend," he said calmly. Tomiwa stood as well, smoothing his jacket. He offered Angela a small nod, a question disguised as courtesy. The sisters rose almost in unison, skirts smooth, napkins folded. Chairs returned to their exact positions. Everything restored. Perfect again. As they moved toward the doorway, proximity became unavoidable. Shoulders passed close. The faint scent of cologne and perfume intertwined briefly in the air. Stephanie felt Thomason's presence behind her, close enough to register warmth, not close enough to accuse. Angela brushed past Tomiwa's sleeve as she stepped forward. Neither looked at the other. They exited separately, yet something lingered behind in the room. The honey jar remained slightly off-center. One teacup sat misaligned by half an inch, tiny imperfections in an otherwise flawless setting. Nothing had happened. No vows broken, no declarations made, no boundaries crossed. And yet, something had shifted. Not in action, but in awareness. And sometimes, awareness was far more dangerous. The day unfolded with intention, as though each of them believed motion could dissolve memory. The palace awoke fully now, sunlight stretching across polished floors, banners stirring faintly in the breeze that slipped through high-arched windows. Servants moved with renewed rhythm. Guards rotated posts. Courtiers arrived with scrolls and sealed requests. It was a day like any other, which made the undercurrent beneath it all the more dangerous. Stephanie immersed herself in responsibility. If emotion threatened discipline, then discipline would prevail. She seated herself in the council chamber long before the appointed hour. Scrolls were laid before her in tidy stacks. Petitions regarding land disputes near the eastern border, ceremonial scheduling for the harvest festival, trade negotiations awaiting ratification. Her handwriting was steady as she annotated margins with decisive strokes. Summon the emissary, she instructed calmly. Her voice carried neither haste nor hesitation. Advisors spoke, arguments were presented, concerns were weighed. Stephanie listened the way she always had, with complete attention. She asked precise questions. She dissected language. She found compromise without sacrificing authority. Those who worked beside her admired her composure. They whispered quietly of her strength, her intellect, her steadiness. None of them noticed the moments, fleeting but real, when her mind drifted. To breakfast, to porcelain and honey, to the warmth of an accidental touch. She corrected herself swiftly each time. This is not indulgence. This is discipline. Her gaze sharpened. Her tone cooled. She signed documents with elegant finality. Yet beneath the polished exterior, something unsettled pressed against her restraint. It had not been the touch itself that disturbed her. It had been the pause afterward. The way Thomason had not immediately withdrawn. The way his eyes had held hers. Not questioning, not apologizing, recognizing. Stephanie closed the final scroll of the afternoon and dismissed the chamber with composed gratitude. Only when the doors shut behind the last advisor did she allow her shoulders to lower half an inch. Half an inch was all she permitted herself. Angela chose a different kind of distraction. Where Stephanie sought stillness, sharpened into control, Angela sought movement, sharpened into exhaustion. The courtyard rang with life. Guards sparred in rotating pairs. Wooden staffs struck in rhythmic precision. Dust rose from the earth beneath quick pivots and lunges. Angela stepped into the center without ceremony. Again, she commanded. Her opponent lunged. She countered fluidly. Their staffs collided with a sharp crack that echoed off stone walls. Sweat gathered at her temples. Sunlight clung to her skin, turning exertion into something almost luminous. She laughed when she disarmed a guard. "Is that all?" she teased. The onlookers grinned. They adored her vitality. Angela Douglas had always been energy made flesh, untamed but controlled, fierce but magnetic. She pushed harder than necessary. She sparred longer than required. She refused water when offered. Between strikes, though, her mind betrayed her. Tomiwa's voice, low when it had dropped just for her. The warmth of his shoulder brushing hers. The ease. That was the worst part. It had been easy. Not forced. Not dramatic. Just natural. She miscalculated a step. Her foot slipped against loose earth. She stumbled, barely. Careful, a guard called instinctively. Angela straightened immediately. Staff lifted again, chin high. I am, she said, flashing a grin. But the grin faded quicker than usual. She was not certain she meant it. The training continued until her muscles burned and her breath came ragged. She welcomed the ache. Physical strain was honest. It did not lie. It did not complicate itself with thought. When she finally dismissed the guards, applause followed her as she exited. She did not turn around. Across the palace, Thomason found no comfort in authority. Meetings concluded swiftly beneath his direction. Trade proposals were negotiated. Security briefings delivered. His answers came measured, intelligent, decisive. Yet impatience lingered beneath his composure like a thread pulled too tight. He prided himself on clarity, on boundaries, on unwavering loyalty. But clarity had thinned. He found himself replaying Stephanie's silence. Not her apology, not her words, her restraint. Angela's laughter had always been predictable, bright, open, immediate. But Stephanie's quiet had weight. It was intentional, controlled. And when she had withdrawn her hand, it had not been flustered. It had been deliberate. That unsettled him more than it should have. He dismissed his final advisor earlier than necessary. Tomorrow, he said curtly, though nothing required delay. When the room emptied, he remained standing at the window overlooking the inner garden. The palace had always felt stable to him. Today it felt aware, as though it too had noticed. Tomiwa fled. Not dramatically, not in anger, but with urgency disguised as spontaneity. He left the palace grounds mid-afternoon, keys turning in the ignition with sharp precision. The engine roared to life. He drove faster than he needed to. Music turned loud enough to crowd out thought. The town greeted him, as it always did, with easy recognition. Shopkeepers waved. Familiar faces called out. Invitations were extended. He smiled. He laughed. He leaned into conversation as though nothing had shifted. Still, something tugged at him. The palace, with its watching walls and careful silences, had followed him. He slowed eventually, leaving the town behind, steering toward the riverbank where the air felt less confined. The engine quieted. The world softened. He rested his elbows against the steering wheel and stared ahead. This shouldn't be complicated, he muttered to himself. He had never been prone to overthinking. Life had always moved with clarity for him. Desire, decision, action. But this was not desire alone. It was connection. And connection required responsibility. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. He did not start the car again for a long while. By evening, they returned, one by one. Stephanie first, then Thomason. Angela later, hair still faintly damp from washing away the dust of training. Tomiwa last. The palace received them without comment. Dinner was set beneath softer light than morning. The atmosphere gentler. Silver replaced porcelain, wine replaced tea. Conversation flowed carefully. How was your day? Thomason asked evenly. Productive, Stephanie replied. And yours? Angela asked Tomiwa. Busy, he said, offering a smile that did not fully reach his eyes. No one pressed. No one mentioned breakfast, but awareness moved beneath the table like a quiet current. Angela avoided leaning too close. Stephanie kept her hands folded neatly in her lap. Thomason measured his gaze. Tomiwa moderated his tone. They were disciplined, they were careful, they were failing, not in action, but in denial. Night came gently. The corridors emptied, footsteps faded, doors closed. In separate rooms, beneath separate ceilings, each lay awake longer than they would admit. Stephanie stared at the canopy above her bed, counting her breaths. Angela turned onto her side, then onto her back, restless. Thomason clasped his hands behind his head, staring into darkness. Tomiwa lay still, listening to the faint hum of the palace settling for the night. They listened to the house breathe, to the silence between rooms, to the invisible threads stretching quietly through furniture walls. Distraction had failed. Movement had failed. Authority had failed. Laughter had failed. Something had been stirred, not recklessly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and no amount of daylight could undo it. They arrived without ceremony. No trumpets, no formal procession, no herald announcing lineage or accomplishment, only a brief murmur among the guards at the gate, low voices carrying recognition rather than alarm. Two men stepped into the palace courtyard as though returning to a place they had once belonged. Not as strangers, not entirely as guests, but as echoes. Stephanie noticed first. She was crossing the inner hall, a folder of documents bounced carefully in her hands, when movement beyond the open archway caught her attention. Sunlight framed two familiar silhouettes. Broad shoulders, familiar posture, and ease of belonging that made her pulse hesitate. Her steps slowed. Her breath caught, just slightly. Memory moved faster than thought. Angela, she said quietly. Angela turned mid-sentence and froze. Elijah? She breathed. The name carried years within it. Elijah Barclay stood taller than memory had preserved him, though his presence had softened rather than hardened with time. Success had not sharpened him into arrogance. It had settled him into quiet assurance. His eyes, still gentle, still observant, found Angela immediately, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, history. A shared language of glances formed long before marriage had rewritten their futures. Time folded. Beside him stood Oriha Omoni, sunlight catching the clean lines of his tailored jacket. Lagos had polished him, confidence sharpened, ambition refined. But the boy Stephanie remembered still lingered beneath the composure. His smile carried familiarity, mischief restrained by maturity. They had grown. They had succeeded. They had returned. We were invited for dinner, Orija said lightly, breaking the stillness with deliberate ease. I hope that wasn't a mistake. Angela's laughter came unfiltered, surprised, genuine. Only if you plan to bring the past with you. Elijah's lips curved in quiet amusement. I wouldn't know how to leave it behind. The words were simple. They were not harmless. News traveled quickly through the palace. By evening, the dining hall was prepared again, this time with an undercurrent no arrangement of porcelain could conceal. Candles burned lower, shadows stretching longer across polished surfaces. The tables seemed to wait. The couples entered together. The guests were already seated. Elijah rose first, greeting Thomason with respectful steadiness. Their handshake was firm, measured, evaluative. It's an honor, Elijah said. Thomason inclined his head. We welcome old friends. The emphasis on old did not go unnoticed. Orija clasped Tomiwa's shoulder in familiar greeting. Still causing trouble, he teased. Tomiwa grinned automatically. Only the manageable kind. Laughter rose briefly, then settled. They took their seats. Dinner carried a different tension than before. Not fragile, not uncertain, but layered. Elijah spoke gently, his voice measured, deliberate. He described his work abroad, the initiatives he had supported, the communities rebuilt under his guidance. His words were thoughtful, grounded. He listened more than he spoke, his attention often drifting unconsciously toward Angela. Their shared history hummed beneath polite conversation. Never acknowledged, never forgotten. Angela felt it in the pauses, in the way he remembered details others overlooked. Her preference for lemon and water, her habit of tapping fingers when thinking. His memory unsettled her more than any overt declaration could have. Across the table, Tomiwa watched, not obviously, but attentively. A flare of something unfamiliar tightened behind his ribs when Elijah laughed softly at Angela's comment, when their eyes lingered a fraction longer than etiquette required. It was not anger. It was quieter, protective, possessive, perhaps. He disliked how quickly the feeling rose. Oriha, meanwhile, filled the room with ease. He traded stories with Tomiwa, ventures in Lagos, narrow escapes from business collapses turned triumphs. His wit remained sharp, his charm effortless. But when Stephanie spoke, he listened as though the room narrowed to her alone. He asked precise questions, remembered her academic interests, recalled debates they once had in university courtyards long before crowns complicated everything. You always believed a structure was strength, Awakens said lightly. I suppose you were right. Stephanie's smile was controlled. And you believed risk was freedom. He laughed softly. I still do. Thomason noticed, not consciously at first, just a tightening in his chest, a sharpening of focus. His posture shifted, subtle, deliberate. His chair angled closer to Stephanie's. His hand brushed the back of hers once under the table. Not accident, not overt claim. A reminder. She did not withdraw. She did not respond either. The gesture lingered between them. Dessert arrived. Conversation softened, but tension did not dissipate. It sat at the table with them, uninvited, yet undeniable. Memory had weight, and tonight it pressed. Later, when dinner dissolved into smaller conversations and servants cleared the remnants of civility, the men stepped outside beneath moonlight. The courtyard held a cooler stillness than before. The fountain murmured softly. Crickets filled silence with rhythm. Elijah stood beside Thomason near the edge of the garden. You've built something solid here, Elijah said quietly, gaze scanning the palace walls. Thomason followed his line of sight. Stability is necessary. Elijah nodded. Yes. A pause. And happiness? Awakens asked from behind them, his tone lighter but not careless. The question lingered. Oluwole leaned casually against a pillar, though his eyes were sharp. He waited. Thomason did not answer immediately. Happiness, he said at last, is maintained. Elijah studied him carefully, or chosen. Silence stretched, not hostile, but assessing. The moonlight revealed more than daylight allowed. Micro-expressions, subtle tension in jaws, guardedness beneath politeness. They were not enemies, but neither were they simple friends anymore. History complicated territory. Elsewhere, inside the palace, Angela and Stephanie sat together in the women's chamber, knees brushing lightly. Candles flickered between them. They were once important, Angela admitted, voice low. Yes, Stephanie replied calmly. They still are. Angela's fingers traced idle circles along her skirt. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if... She did not finish. Stephanie understood anyway. We do not live in hypotheticals, she said softly. Angela exhaled. That doesn't mean they disappear. Stephanie's gaze softened, just slightly. No, it doesn't. Angela looked at her sister carefully. Does it frighten you? The question was not about Elijah or Awakens. It was about proximity, about choice, about the fragile lines that now seemed more visible than before. Stephanie considered carefully before answering. No, she said at last. It reminds me that nothing is ever as simple as we pretend. Angela absorbed that. Do you think they came back by coincidence? Stephanie glanced toward the window where moonlight traced the floor. In this palace, she said quietly, I doubt anything is coincidence. Upstairs, the guests settled into chambers once familiar. Elijah stood alone near the window, staring at the courtyard below. His expression was thoughtful, not longing, not regretful, but aware. Awakens loosened his tie and laughed softly to himself. Complicated, he murmured. Across the hall, Thomason remained awake longer than usual. Opemipo paced once before forcing himself still. The palace felt fuller now, not louder, heavier, as though old chapters had reopened without warning. Above them all, the moon watched without preference. And the palace, ever patient, ever listening, took note, not of betrayal, not of desire, but of possibility. And possibility, it knew, was far more dangerous than memory. Morning found the palace alert. Not restless, attentive, as though every wall, every corridor, every carved arch had leaned slightly inward to listen. The presence of Elijah and Awakens had shifted the air, stirring old echoes that refused to stay buried, as if the stones themselves remembered days long before crowns or arrangements had dictated life. Thomason noticed it first at breakfast. Elijah sat across from Angela, his posture relaxed, his attention gentle but unmistakable. He asked after her work, her health, her small joys, the kind of questions born not of curiosity alone, but of intimacy remembered. Angela answered easily, her laughter soft, her shoulders loosening in a way Thomason had not seen since the night of their wedding. Thomason's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He reached for the teapot before a servant could, pouring for Stephanie with deliberate care. His movements were calm, almost tender, but precise, deliberate. A quiet declaration, almost unspoken, that the space she occupied belonged first to him. Stephanie accepted the cup without comment, though her fingers brushed his for a fraction longer than necessary. A spark passed in that brief contact, silent and electric, and then it was gone. But both noticed it. Both felt the weight. Across the table, Tomiwa watched Oriha lean closer to Stephanie, his voice low, his expression open and unguarded. Oriha spoke of shared memories, school projects long forgotten, late-night dreams exchanged in whispers before life hardened into responsibility. His words were familiar, grounding. They carried the gentle danger of things once cherished. Stephanie smiled, a small curve of lips, careful and measured, but warmth lingered there despite her control. Tomiwa's laughter rang suddenly, louder than decorum demanded. "You know," he said smoothly, standing, "Angela, you mentioned wanting to show me the new training grounds." Angela blinked, startled. "I did?" "You did," he replied evenly, offering his hand. She hesitated just a second, then took it. The touch was fleeting, yet a rhythm of connection passed between them. Elijah's gaze followed as they left. He did not move to intervene, did not speak, did not change posture. Yet something settled behind his eyes. Quiet vigilance, patient and unresolved. Later that day, Thomason requested Stephanie's presence in the inner garden. It was not unusual. Summons were frequent, often routine. But today carried a weight, formality dressed in something sharper than protocol. They walked in silence beneath the shade of ancient trees. Water murmured in the background, winding through the gardens in a gentle rhythm that measured their steps. When they stopped, Thomason turned to her, gaze level, unwavering. "You are not obligated to entertain the past," he said evenly, the words carrying authority, yet not coldness. Stephanie met his gaze, unflinching. "Nor are you obligated to feel threatened by it," she replied. A pause, charged and deliberate. "I am not threatened," he said. She lifted an eyebrow slightly. "Then why summon me?" Thomason considered her carefully. The light fell across his face in angles that emphasized strength without harshness. "Because," he said finally, "I am responsible for you now, and responsibility does not mean indifference." Her breath caught, not because of the words themselves, but because of the care in their delivery, the deliberate framing of devotion beneath restraint. Responsibility wrapped around them both like the shade of the trees, quiet, protective, unyielding. Stephanie nodded slowly. "I understand." They lingered in that pause, neither stepping closer, neither retreating, but both aware of the invisible tether that linked them. That evening, Tomiwa found Angela at the edge of the courtyard, gazing as the sky darkened. Stars had begun to prick the horizon, distant and patient. "You don't have to explain anything," he said quietly, joining her. Angela smiled faintly. "That sounds like something someone says when they want an explanation." He chuckled, soft and warm. "Maybe. Or maybe it's something someone says when they realize love doesn't always announce itself politely." She looked at him then, really looked, in a way that had little to do with playfulness and more with acknowledgement. "You're jealous," she said softly. Tomiwa did not deny it. He exhaled, a subtle weight lifted by confession. "I didn't know what to call it," he admitted. "But I know I don't like the idea of anyone else thinking they still belong where I stand." Angela's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something warmer. Something rooted in acknowledgement of what had been unspoken until now. "Neither do I," she said. Their hands found each other in the quiet, fingers interlacing without ceremony, without fuss. A pact without words. A protection of space, of presence, of the fragile territory of trust. Across the palace, Stephanie felt a similar tether tighten around her. She traced her fingers along the edge of her desk, feeling the small weight of the teacup Thomason had poured for her earlier. Not indulgence, not obligation. A line drawn, clear and precise, signaling care without intrusion. The past had arrived in corporeal form. The men, their laughter, their familiar ease. But the present was learning to shield itself. Carefully, deliberately, with gentle authority. Stephanie thought of the walls around them, the thick stone corridors, the arches and windows that had silently absorbed the lives of all who passed. The palace, patient and watchful, was more than a building. It was a guardian. And today it seemed to lean closer, listening not just to voices, but to intentions, to silences, to the careful choreography of loyalty and affection. As night deepened, the corridors emptied. Guards and servants retreated behind doors, the echoes of the day fading into the hush of shadow and candlelight. Stephanie remained in the inner chamber, eyes tracing the moonlight spilling across the floor. Her thoughts, though disciplined, wandered to the breakfast table. Orisia's quiet attentiveness, the brush of Thomason's fingers, the warmth that radiated from a glance. Across the palace, Angela and Tomiwa lingered longer in the courtyard, hands still entwined. The world beyond the palace walls could wait. The city's hum, the distant murmur of life. None of it mattered as much as this small, intentional space, where presence mattered more than words. Somewhere between corridors and courtyards, the old stone and carved wood of the palace seemed to lean closer, protective, patient, aware. It listened, it observed, it shielded. The past had arrived, but the present, careful, deliberate, unwavering, was already learning how to protect itself. The guardianship was unspoken, and that, Stephanie realized as she sipped the cooling tea, was the most powerful form of all. The palace, the people within it, the invisible threads that tied them together. None of it needed ceremony to exist. It simply did. And in that quiet understanding, they found something stronger than confrontation, deeper than nostalgia, and more enduring than fleeting memory. A day of vigilance, a day of connection, a day of protection. And yet the air still whispered that the work was only beginning. They arrived like weather, unannounced,
Welcome to Zoo Lily, a shopping paradise with deals
uncontainable, loud enough to rearrange the atmosphere of the house without asking permission. The guards barely had time. They arrived like weather, unannounced, uncontainable, loud enough to rearrange the atmosphere of the house without asking permission. The guards barely had time to announce them before laughter spilled into the courtyard. Bright, layered, unmistakably synchronized. Love, mercy, grace. The Adadal triplets. They stepped into the palace as though it belonged to them by right, dressed with careless confidence, moving in seamless formation despite their differences. Love walked first, eyes sharp, lips curved in a knowing smile, every step measured yet effortless. Mercy followed, softer in step, but no less observant, her gaze scanning the surroundings like a tactician, cataloging every detail. Grace trailed behind, her presence buoyant, curiosity lighting her face, arms occasionally flailing as she gestured to something unseen, like the air itself was part of her conversation. Brothers, Grace called out joyfully, arms wide, her voice carrying across the courtyard like a bell. Tomiwa groaned, running a hand over his face. We didn't know you were coming. Love grinned, a spark of mischief in his eyes. That was intentional. Thomason sighed, rubbing his temple with slow precision. You could have sent word. Mercy shrugged lightly, tilting her head in a manner that suggested both innocence and challenge. Where's the adventure in that? The triplets embraced their brothers with affection that carried history, shared grief, shared survival, and the sort of bond that only comes from being the sole constants in each other's lives. Their parents had died young. The Odadal siblings had raised one another in fragments and resilience. This was not just family. This was alliance. Stephanie and Angela entered the courtyard moments later, stepping lightly across the polished stone that reflected the morning sun. The triplets turned as one, eyes widening, grins spreading like wildfire. Well, Love said slowly, eyes bright with curiosity, these must be the wives. Angela smiled easily, her posture relaxed, her presence luminous even in the soft sunlight. We are. Grace clapped her hands, spinning slightly on her heel. Oh, I already like her. Stephanie inclined her head politely, her composure intact despite the energy swirling around her. Welcome. Mercy studied them both with a calm, piercing gaze. "You're glowing," she remarked, noting the subtle confidence that radiated from Stephanie and the effortless warmth of Angela. Angela laughed lightly, a soft exhale that seemed to settle the energy around them. "It's been a long week." Grace leaned in conspiratorially, lowering her voice despite the open space of the courtyard. "It shows, in a good way." Stephanie met Mercy's gaze, and in that moment, something unreadable passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or intuition. A quiet acknowledgement that beneath formality and ceremony, instinct spoke louder than words. The palace adapted quickly, as it always did when new energy entered. Rooms were reassigned, corridors buzzed, meals expanded. Servants hustled to accommodate the sudden surge of presence, adjusting schedules, replenishing supplies, and recalibrating the rhythm of their days to match the exuberance of the triplets. Noise increased. Laughter echoed through halls that had grown too quiet, bouncing off marble and wood in a way that seemed almost celebratory. Windows opened to catch the breeze. Curtains shifted. Doors swung wide. Even the air smelled of possibility, charged with the weight of past routines, breaking to make room for this new, vibrant chaos. Grace mentioned casually over lunch, her voice teasing. "Elijah should stop by this weekend." Angela nearly choked on her drink, coughing into her napkin. "Oh?" she managed, heart jumping at the memory of that familiar presence. "Oh, yes," Grace said undeterred, eyes glinting with humor. "He deserves a visit." Tomiwa's smile was polite, measured, but his eyes narrowed just a fraction. "And Orija?" he asked carefully, tone light but alert. Love added smoothly, his grin broadening. "We know him from school. He's a fine addition to any gathering." Thomason's head lifted sharply from his plate, his expression taut with precision. "You invited them?" Grace blinked, as though incredulity were the only proper response to protocol. "Of course. Why not?" Mercy, always the quiet observer, smiled faintly. "It will be interesting," she said, her tone even yet hinting at hidden amusement. No one disagreed aloud, but the palace listened, and something ancient shifted. The stones, the carvings, the walls that had absorbed centuries of footfall and whisper. These two leaned closer, preparing once more for events that were bigger than the sum of their occupants' intentions. The triplets wasted no time immersing themselves in the rhythm of palace life. Love found Tomiwa easily, matching him step for step, teasing and challenging with the ease of familiarity. Their banner carried history, inside jokes and long-standing rivalries softened by affection. Mercy stayed close to Stephanie, her sharp gaze not missing a gesture, a glance, or the subtle movements that betrayed a disciplined mind. She asked questions that seemed casual but carried a depth designed to understand, to read, to map the terrain of Stephanie's thoughts and emotions. Stephanie answered carefully, her measured tone balancing caution and grace, aware that Mercy's attention was not idle but purposeful. Grace flitted between Angela and the staff, laughter spilling from her in waves, her curiosity infectious. She delighted in details others might overlook. The fold of a sleeve, the tilt of a head, the way light fell through the windows. Angela found herself laughing more freely than she had in weeks, caught up in Grace's energy and ease, even as the quiet tension of presence lingered beneath the surface. By evening, the palace had settled into a new rhythm. Conversations meandered, punctuated by bursts of laughter and shared stories. Candles were lit early, flickering along the polished halls, reflecting light off marble floors and gilded frames. Outside, the gardens held the last warmth of the sun, shadows stretching long and slender across the paths, where the triplets wandered in pairs, small groups, or alone, each discovering the palace on their own terms. Thomason observed from a distance, seated at a high-backed chair, the lines of his posture tight with both curiosity and a need for order. Tomiwa stayed close to Angela, their hands occasionally brushing, a reminder that presence and protection were intertwined. The palace seemed to breathe with them, listening, responding, leaning ever so slightly toward these new energies while guarding its quiet sanctity. Even Stephanie felt the subtle shift. The courtyard, the inner corridors, the very air seemed charged with expectation, anticipation, and the unspoken knowledge that the triplets' arrival was not merely a social visit, but a disturbance. A reminder that the past and the present could coexist, collide, and recalibrate in the same heartbeat. And so the palace watched, as it always did. As the night drew on, the candles dimmed, laughter faded to quiet murmur, and the triplets finally settled in their rooms. Yet the echo of their energy remained, threading through corridors, across staircases, and into the chambers of those who had already come to inhabit its walls. The day had arrived, unannounced. The palace had adapted. And something, deep within it, stirred, ancient, patient, alive. History had returned in the form of 3 voices, 3 presences, 3 hearts that would alter the rhythm of life within these walls. And the palace, as always, listened. By evening, the palace no longer pretended to rest. Laughter arose from the upper chambers, where the triplets had claimed space without negotiation. Music played softly, nothing ceremonial, nothing traditional. Just rhythm, just pulse. Grace sprawled across a chaise, hair loose, eyes bright with mischief. "We should play something," she announced, her voice carrying across the high-ceiling room. "Truth or dare? It's been ages." Love lifted her brow, a slow smirk forming. "In this house, with these people?" Mercy's lips curved faintly, her gaze sharp and unflinching. "That's precisely why," she said. Elijah and Aresia had joined them not long after sunset, invited without formality, welcomed without question. Familiarity settled quickly, threaded with nostalgia and something sharper beneath it, a hint of old bonds brushing against the new order of the palace. "I vote dare," Aresia said easily, leaning back against the sofa. "Truth gets boring." Grace laughed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Of course you would." And so the game began lightly. A sip of palm wine, a song half remembered, hummed more than sung. A confession that revealed nothing too deeply, meant only to tease. Yet as the night stretched on, the dares lingered longer than expected. A look was held past politeness. A hand brushed, paused, and did not immediately withdraw. Eyes met in fleeting moments charged with unspoken acknowledgement. The palace seemed aware of every movement, every intention, holding its breath in quiet anticipation. Mercy studied Elijah closely, noting the slight twitch at the corner of his smile, the way his eyes softened just before they hardened again. Not with hunger, not with envy, with curiosity, with recognition. "You always look like you're diagnosing the room," she teased softly, tilting her head. Elijah smiled gently, not defensive, not dismissive. "Old habit," he said. His voice carried the weight of someone who had watched and waited more than acted. "Then, diagnose this," Grace said, sweeping her hand across the circle, her gesture exaggerated, theatrical. "What do you see?" Elijah's gaze drifted, over laughter, over closeness, over unspoken things humming just beneath the surface. He paused, eyes lingering on Angela's quiet laughter, the careful tilt of Tomiwa's shoulder, the subtle restraint in Stephanie's smile, and the unshakable poise of Thomason. Always observing, always measuring. "I see people pretending they don't know what they feel," he said simply. Silence followed, not awkward, charged, heavy with the awareness that some truths were too close to the skin to ignore. Elsewhere in the palace, as Stephanie paused at the foot of the grand staircase, hand resting lightly on the banister, sensing it, the shift, the energy, the subtle hum of expectation. The corners of the walls seemed to lean closer, listening. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. But the pulse of sound, the murmur of voices, even the soft laughter from upstairs had already invaded the calm she had tried to cultivate. Angela felt it too, stopping mid-step in the opposite corridor. She had been returning from the training hall, the echoes of her footsteps fading slowly, but the energy from the upper chambers tugged at her attention. She pressed her back to the cool stone wall, letting her palm rest there as though to anchor herself. Neither sister joined the game. They did not need to, yet neither could sleep, not while the air in the palace was alive with movement and intention, not while walls carried memory and resonance in equal measure. Thomason stood by the window in his chamber, the folds of his robe carefully adjusted, eyes tracing the lights glowing where there should have been darkness. The lanterns of the upper floors cast long, flickering shadows across the courtyard below. He noted the shifts in sound, the rhythm of voices, and the subtle rise in laughter. Control, he reminded himself. was necessary. The palace demanded discipline, as did his own sense of order. Yet even he could not ignore the undercurrent, the way the night had been transformed by presence, energy, and history brushing lightly against the present. Tomiwa lay back on his bed in the adjacent chamber, staring at the ceiling with an intensity that belied the ease he usually carried. Restless, uncertain, something about the soft rhythm of laughter, the teasing voices of friends, the weight of the past brushing against the present, had set his thoughts in motion. He shifted, trying to locate the source of his discomfort. It was not fear, not anger, not jealousy, but something more insistent, something that tightened the chest without warning, something that demanded acknowledgement without needing words. The palace breathed around them all. Every hall, every stair, every carefully placed object vibrated with an awareness older than anyone present. It leaned into moments, listening, waiting. Truths hovered, unnamed. Dares waited. Patient, and somewhere between laughter and restraint, the past brushed the present, lightly, insistently, testing what would give. Grace, as always, noticed everything first. She leaned back on the chaise, eyes scanning the room as though she could read the air itself. "You know," she said lightly, "the palace feels different tonight. Can you feel it?" Love shrugged, swirling the wine in his cup. "It's just us," he said, though the tension behind his words suggested he felt the weight of more than just their presence. Mercy did not answer immediately. She tilted her head, noting the subtle interplay of gazes, the hesitant movements, the fingers brushing lightly, as if testing boundaries. "It's not us," she said finally. "It's them." Elijah's gaze followed hers, and for a brief moment, his smile faded. "The sisters," he said quietly. "They carry something unspoken." Grace's laugh rang out, bright and unrestrained. "So what? We're all psychic now? This is the game?" Elijah met her eyes, calm. "Perhaps we just recognize when something matters more than it should." By the time the moon had climbed high, the room had grown quieter, though no less alive. Fingers lingered near hands, eyes met and broke deliberately. Conversations dipped into whispered tones. Laughter softened to hums, the teasing to gentle smiles, and the rhythm of the house shifted imperceptibly. Stephanie walked past the upper chambers, stopping at a doorway, and watched the flickering candlelight from the shadows. Angela did the same on the other side of the palace, listening to the distant strains of music, feeling the pull of connection and history, of presence and attention. Below, Thomason, Tomiwa, and the others processed the night in their own way, each sensing the subtle shift, each feeling the gentle insistence of truth, and each noting the unspoken protections that had begun to form between hearts and histories. The game had started lightly, but its echoes would not be contained by laughter alone. And somewhere between teasing and restraint, between whispered dares and glances too long, the palace, ancient, patient, and endlessly observant, recorded every heartbeat, every hesitation, every fleeting moment of recognition, waiting for what would come next. Truths and dares, laughter and longing, past and present, they all moved together now, entwined, inevitable. The night was far from over, and the palace, as always, listened. Morning did not scold them. It arrived softly, almost indulgent, as though it understood that the night had loosened something none of them yet knew how to gather back into place. The sunlight filtered through high windows, painting gold across polished floors, gilded archways, and the intricate tapestries that lined the hall. Even the air seemed warmer, more patient, carrying the faint residue of candle smoke and the distant notes of last night's laughter. The palace woke in fragments. Doors opened slowly. Footsteps moved with care. The faint rustle of silk or linen was followed by near imperceptible glances toward the upper chambers, where the echoes of joy and mischief had lingered the longest. It was as though the house itself had paused, listening, and remembering. Stephanie was the first to descend the grand staircase. She wore pale linen, her hair loosely bound, her face composed but thoughtful. Each step was measured, graceful, deliberate. She paused when she heard voices already gathered at the table. The sound of Grace's laughter, unrestrained musical, cut through the quiet like sunlight through morning mist. Stephanie inhaled slowly, steadying herself, aware that the room held more than the sum of its occupants. Angela followed moments later, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her smile appeared almost instinctively, softening the edges of her face. The way the morning light caught her hair made it seem like it was woven with gold threads. She did not speak immediately, merely observing the lively scene below, letting herself be drawn in gradually. Breakfast had been laid generously. Croissants still warm, fruit sliced with precision, and steam rising from cups of tea and coffee that scented the air with cinnamon and citrus. The maidservants moved with quiet efficiency, but their glances lingered more often than necessary toward the guests, toward the subtle electricity that had settled over the room overnight. The triplets were already seated. Grace lounged across her chair, silk robe slipping slightly at the shoulder, utterly unconcerned. Her energy dominated the space, effortless and infectious. Love sat poised, eyes alert, reading the room with practiced ease. Lips pressed in a small, knowing smile, Mercy stirred her tea slowly, gaze distant yet keen, as though observing more than the immediate scene. Elijah and Arijah sat among them, relaxed in posture but alert in expression. The easy intimacy of shared history clung to them like an invisible thread, tangible to anyone who looked closely. They leaned into stories, gestures, glances, never overstepping, but their presence reminded everyone at the table of the past, of connections that time and distance had not erased. When Stephanie entered, Arijah rose instinctively, a small courtesy born of habit and something unspoken beneath it. When Angela appeared, Elijah smiled without thinking, that gentle warmth that had always been reserved for her alone, effortless and undeniable. The reactions were slight, fleeting, but they were noticed by some more than others. Thomasin and Tomiwa arrived together, each moving with the quiet assurance of men accustomed to reading rooms. Their eyes swept the table in a single glance. Who sat where? Who leaned toward whom? Who looked up too quickly? There was nothing improper, but everything suggested more than casual attention. Thomasin cleared his throat lightly. "Good morning," he said, voice even, controlled, carrying the weight of authority that had always been his armor. "Morning," Grace chimed brightly. "You missed all the fun last night." Tomiwa raised an eyebrow, half amused, half cautious. "I doubt that." Love laughed softly, low and easy. "You're too stiff?" Angela leaned toward Stephanie, voice a whisper. "How do you cope?" Stephanie's lips curved faintly, a shadow of a smile. "I observe," she replied, tone measured. Her eyes flicked to Thomasin and Tomiwa, noting the subtle tension, the careful posture, the slight narrowing of attention when old friends crossed new boundaries. Conversation flowed, but not freely. The stories surfaced. Oxford, MIT, late nights, and ambitions nurtured across continents. The triplets reminisced loudly, laughing over shared mischief, teasing each other with recollections that belonged to all of them and to none. Elijah and Arijah filled in details with ease, seamlessly blending past and present. Their familiarity was undeniable, but carefully moderated, a reminder of intimacy restrained by civility. Thomasin listened more than he spoke, noting each gesture, each glance, each laugh that lingered longer than decorum suggested. Tomiwa watched in quieter, subtler ways, registering the minor shifts in tone and posture, the almost imperceptible moments of recognition between Angela and Elijah, between Stephanie and Arijah. And the sisters, both Douglas women, felt it then, a subtle pressure beneath the surface. Not desire alone, not jealousy, something more complex, awareness. They were not untouched by what surrounded them. They were simply choosing not to name it. Yet, as plates were cleared and cups refilled, the ritual of movement became a game of precision and restraint. Thomasin rose first, adjusting his cuffs with deliberate care. "We all have obligations today," he said evenly. "Let's not forget ourselves in indulgence." Grace smirked, amused by the careful formality of his words. "Always the responsible one," she said lightly, though not unkindly. Mercy offered a gentler counterbalance, lifting her teacup in a small, polite gesture. "He keeps the balance," she said softly, and the words carried more truth than anyone would dare voice aloud. As they dispersed, toward chambers, toward duties, toward carefully constructed distance, the palace exhaled. The warmth of laughter lingered faintly in the corners, yet its intensity had faded. A hush settled over the rooms, heavy with the knowledge that what had been loosened the night before had not been forgotten. And yet, despite the outward return to order, the echo remained. It vibrated in the polished wood of the floors, in the carved stone of archways, in the lingering scent of tea and fruit. It clung invisibly to the air between them, the subtle certainty that restraint, once tested, is never quite the same again. Stephanie paused in the inner hall, listening to the distant footsteps fading away. She pressed a hand to her chest, as feeling the quiet thrum of awareness there, a soft, insistent echo of what had passed. Angela lingered briefly at the doorway to her chambers, glancing back toward the dining room, catching a glimpse of Grace, leaning lazily in her chair, Love observing the room like a hawk, and Mercy turning her gaze inward, reflective. Something had shifted. Something had been tested. And though they all walked away with composure intact, none could ignore the truth. Outside, the morning sun rose higher, spilling its light across the palace gardens. Birds called in tentative harmonies. The fountain whispered against stone, and the world continued its rhythms, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet within the walls of the palace, the echo of the night persisted, subtle but undeniable. A reminder that the past and present, laughter and longing, caution and curiosity, could never fully be disentangled. Even as the palace moved forward into the day, a single quiet certainty remained. Some bonds, once touched, never truly returned to their prior shape. And some awareness, once awakened, refuses to sleep. The Douglas sisters understood this more than anyone. And as they prepared to step into the duties of the day, Stephanie into careful observation, Angela into movement and engagement, they carried the quiet acknowledgement of it with them. The palace watched, patient. The triplets laughed somewhere within its walls. Elijah and Arija lingered in memory and presence alike. And somewhere in the unspoken space between gestures, smiles, and glances, a subtle tension, lightly playful, insistently attentive, took hold. Restraint had been tested, and it had changed everything. How much they thought it did.
How do you turn AI complexity into business growth? This is where the new ITIL comes in. The common language that drives growth across the organization with clarity and speed. AI native by design.
Love smiled sweetly, the kind of smile that disarmed even the most cautious. Family. Plans without permission. The triplets moved as one mind, wearing three bodies. By midday, they had taken over the sitting room. Laptops open, phones ringing, voices overlapping in excitement. Maps were sprawled across the table. Wildlife reserves circled in bright markers. Travel times calculated. Hotels bookmarked in color-coded grids. Notes were scribbled on scraps of paper. Digital reminders pinged in constant rhythm. It was organized chaos, loud, thrilling, unstoppable. Grace clapped her hands once, the sound ringing through the high-ceiling room. Safari. Angela paused mid-step, hand on the back of a chair. What? Safari, Love repeated, eyes bright and wide. Inkari Game Reserve, then Sandy Wildlife Park. Mercy nodded, calm as ever. There's a warm spring, too. Wiki. They say the water heals. Heals what? Tomia asked, cautiously, raising an eyebrow. Grace grinned, leaning forward conspiratorially. Everything. No one laughed. Not because it wasn't funny, but because they could all sense what was coming next. The energy in the room had shifted, crackling with the inevitability of movement, of action taken without permission. We've booked the flights, Love continued casually, as though discussing lunch instead of rearranging the entire weekend. Bauchi. Private plane. Stephanie blinked, her hand hovering over the arm of her chair. You've... what? Mercy looked up, calm, unbothered. 2 to 4 hours. Easy. Thomason's voice was measured, controlled, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. We planned this without consulting anyone. Grace shrugged. We're adults. And guests, he added carefully, a reminder that not everything in the palace belonged to them, no matter how much they thought it did. Love smiled sweetly, the kind of smile that disarmed even the most cautious. Family, she corrected gently. Silence stretched, thick and heavy with the knowledge that resistance here was a theater they had already lost. Tomiwa exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He knew this tone all too well, the one that carried adventure like a banner and expected compliance. Resistance would only prolong the inevitable. Angela broke the silence unexpectedly. "When do we leave?" Her voice was bright, curious, but there was something more. Eagerness laced with anticipation. All eyes turned to her. Grace beamed. 1 hour, 30 minutes. The room erupted into motion. Suitcases were pulled from storage with the precision of long practice. Clothes were chosen hastily, casual, light, adventurous, but somehow intentional in their coordination. The Douglas sisters dressed alike without planning. Fitted jeans, sheer tops, sneakers laced tightly, ready for movement. Angela's red, vibrant as flame. Stephanie's black, deep as night, absorbing attention quietly without demanding it. Their husbands noticed. Thomason's gaze lingered longer than necessary, calculating, observing. Every fold of fabric, every casual gesture was noted, catalogued. His mind ticked through possibilities, scenarios, outcomes, and still, he could not find a reason to intervene. Not fully, not yet. Tomiwa smiled openly, easy, warm, relaxed. "You both look good." His tone carried more than a compliment, approval, recognition, and perhaps something dangerously close to admiration. The triplets emerged next, bold and unapologetic in their choices. Bob shorts, asymmetric tops, colors clashing with deliberate artistry, confidence radiating, love, mercy, and grace, dressed as though daring the world to keep up, and indeed the world, or at least this palace, would have little choice but to follow. Elijah and Orisia appeared last, khaki trousers, striped shirts, sleeves rolled, relaxed but ready, attuned to the rhythm of everyone around them. Their presence reminded the sisters and their husbands that the past, memories, friendships, bonds, was never fully absent. It could arrive at any moment, light and vivid, altering the present with a single look or laugh. By the time the chauffeur arrived, the palace had surrendered. The doors remained open, corridors emptied, shadows receding. Even the walls seemed to lean in, observing the final preparations with silent curiosity. The Cadillac Escalade idled at the gate, gleaming beneath the bright afternoon sun, reflecting shards of warmth across the courtyard stones. Its polished chrome mirrors the chaos in miniature, as though the vehicle itself had absorbed the energy of the household. Grace checked her watch theatrically. Time waits for no one. The sisters exchanged a glance. Stephanie's lips curved faintly, a mixture of apprehension and delight. Angela's eyes shone like fire, the flush of excitement warming her cheeks. They climbed into the vehicle with laughter and tension packed tightly together, a woven fabric of anticipation and daring. The triplets occupied the back seats like commanders of a mission, directing conversation, laughter spilling in waves. Elijah and Orisia settled beside the sisters, subtle smiles shared across brief, meaningful glances. Thomason and Tomiwa rode up front, silent for a moment, each man attuned to the energy crackling behind them. Thomason's hands rested lightly on his knees, knuckles tight but controlled. Tomiwa's posture was relaxed, but his eyes never left the rearview mirror, catching the flicker of movement, the brush of hands, the shared glances that spoke of histories intertwined. The palace, now quiet, did not protest. Its great doors had swung open in consent and curiosity. The walls, the high windows, the carved stone floors. They watched silently, recording every motion, every laugh, every flicker of awareness. And when the vehicle finally rolled down the driveway, the triplets' laughter still ringing. Angela and Stephanie leaning back in their seats, the men's eyes flicking in quiet calculation. The palace exhaled. It did not scold. It did not interfere. It only remembered. The corridors seemed emptier than usual. The air, once vibrant with motion, now carried the weight of absence. Servants moved with measured steps, careful not to disturb the echoes of energy that had passed. Even the sunlight streaming across the tiled floors seemed softer, as if the building itself paused to mark the moment. Inside the car, Grace leaned over to Angela, voice low but vibrant. "Did you know about this?" Angela shook her head, a grin tugging at her lips. "Not a clue." "Exactly," Grace said, triumphant. "That's the point." Mercy added quietly, "Sometimes the plan arrives before the permission does. It's how we know the world still works in our favor." Stephanie, beside Oricha, observed quietly, absorbing every detail. The way Love's eyes sparkled when the vehicle hit a bump. How Tamila's hand brushed lightly against Angela's in reassurance. How Thomason's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly as he calculated the inevitable cascade of events. The road stretched ahead, wide and sunlit. Wind lifted loose strands of hair from the sisters' faces, carrying with it the lingering warmth of the palace, the memory of its watchful presence. Grace clapped her hands once more, full of uncontainable delight. Adventure awaits, and none of us asked for permission. Angela laughed, leaning into the sound. Stephanie smiled quietly, feeling the rush of anticipation bubble beneath her composed exterior. Tomiwa glanced back briefly, his grin slow and knowing. Thomason remained steady, vigilant, yet even he could not mask the faintest flicker of acknowledgement. The palace would remember this day. It would remember how laughter had filled spaces previously controlled, how plans had been made without consent, how the past, present, and future had converged in a single, uncontainable moment. And somewhere in that memory, the palace knew. It had witnessed the first ripple of change, a wave no wall, no rule, and no restraint could ever fully contain. The land changed beneath them. Red soil gave way to vast stretches of green and gold as the plain descended, the horizon widening until it felt impossible to hold everything in one breath. Yankari greeted them not with ceremony, but with silence, deep, expansive, alive. Stephanie felt it immediately. "This place," she murmured as they stepped onto the tarmac. "It listens differently." Angela smiled, eyes bright. "You always say that, and I'm always right," Stephanie replied softly, letting the warmth of the sun settle on her shoulders. She inhaled deeply, tasting the air, dry, earthy, and yet alive with movement she could not see. Tomiwa watched her from across the group, noting the slight curve of her lips, the quiet awe in her posture. He knew that Stephanie's observations were never casual. This place had spoken to her, and he felt it too, as though the world around them had shifted its rhythm to match the one they carried inside. The reserve unfolded like an old story being retold. Elephants moved with quiet authority, their massive forms steady and unhurried, tusks gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. Antelopes scattered in graceful bursts, bodies arching like poetry mid-leap. Camels swayed patiently beneath the sun, carrying laughter and nervous delight as the group climbed onto their backs. The air smelled faintly of dust and green grass, of water not yet evaporated under the heat, of history alive in every blade of grass. Grace shrieked with joy as the camel beneath her shifted its weight. "Faster, come on." Love laughed, fearless and unrestrained, leaning slightly to nudge her camel forward. "Careful, or you'll throw yourself off." Mercy closed her eyes, absorbing the rhythm, swaying slightly with the movement, letting the world settle around her shoulders. She didn't need to speak. Her presence was a quiet anchor in the chaos of excitement. Elijah walked beside Angela, his eyes careful, protective, not in a controlling way, but in that way that only comes from long familiarity and unspoken concern. He watched the tilt of her head, the laugh that escaped too freely, the way sunlight caught in her hair, and he felt something older and deeper stir. Orija found himself beside Stephanie, pointing out carvings etched into stone, ancient artwork, symbols older than language. "These were left by people who believed memory lived in objects," he said quietly, almost reverently. Stephanie traced a symbol lightly, fingertips brushing the rough surface. "I think they were right," she murmured. The stone felt alive beneath her hand, not simply worn by time, but holding it, compressing centuries into each groove. She drew in a breath, the sun warming her back, feeling history pressed gently against her skin. At Wiki Warm Spring, steam curled gently into the air like silk ribbons dancing in a breeze. The water glowed, clear, inviting, ancient. It seemed to breathe as they approached, shifting softly in response to their presence. They entered slowly, reverently. The warmth wrapped around them, loosening muscles, quieting minds. Conversation softened, laughter faded into sighs. Each step into the water was a small surrender, a letting go of the boundaries they carried from the palace, from years of expectation and discipline. Angela floated briefly, eyes closed, her face lifted toward the sky. The water seemed to support her entirely, and for the first time since arriving, she let herself exhale completely. Tomiwa lingered at the edge, his gaze never leaving her. Something tender tightened in his chest, a quiet awareness that he would guard this moment in memory, long after it faded from sight. He did not speak. He did not move closer. Yet every instinct in him urged a protective closeness, a silent promise. Stephanie rested near the water's edge, the gentle lap at her shoulders, anchoring her, grounding her. Thomason sat nearby, close enough to feel her warmth, far enough to respect the silence between them. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was enough, a calm authority that reassured without intrusion. No one touched, yet everyone felt held. The water reflected the sky above, mirrored in soft ripples. Clouds moved lazily, tracing patterns that reminded them all how small they were, and yet how connected to each other, to the land, to moments that felt larger than life. As evening fell, the sky crowded with stars. They gathered around a low fire. The glow from the flames highlighted the lines of their faces, the glimmer of anticipation in their eyes, and shadows that danced across skin and earth alike. Stories surfaced, childhood memories once hidden behind polite smiles, ambitions spoken aloud for the first time, confessions half made, then swallowed back into quiet. Elijah told of nights spent wandering his old neighborhood, memories of Angela's laughter echoing through corridors of memory. Orija recounted dreams he had once shared with Stephanie, now tinged with nostalgia. The triplets added color and exaggeration, their voices overlapping in excitement, each story punctuated by laughter or incredulous looks. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward into the night, where stars blinked in response. Shadows stretched and merged, separating and returning, the lines between the past and present blurred. Not in action, but in awareness. They were all attuned to subtleties. A glance held too long, a pause in speech, a breath taken just a beat too late. Each movement carried meaning. Each silence was weighted. Angela leaned slightly towards Stephanie, her shoulder brushing briefly. Stephanie did not move away. Instead, she allowed the touch, a quiet acknowledgement of closeness without words. The two sisters had always understood each other, but here in the wild, that understanding deepened, carried by the quiet pulse of earth and water. Tomiwa leaned closer to Angela, voice low and gentle. "You belong here," he said softly. "Not just in this place, but in this moment." Angela turned her head slightly, catching his eyes in the firelight. "I do," she admitted, the words nearly lost in the wind. Stephanie watched the interaction quietly, a faint smile tugging at her lips, noting how Thomason's presence beside her remained steady, careful, and deliberate. He did not intrude, but she knew he understood. Understood that this place, this night, allowed truths to surface without confrontation. They slept that night with the earth beneath them, dreams vivid and restless. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant cry of nocturnal birds, the murmur of unseen creatures formed a lullaby. Each soul rested, yet remained alert, hearts open to the language of the land. Somewhere deep within the reserve, hidden beneath roots and soil, something old nodded, witnessed, approved, perhaps even guided. The land remembered their presence, cataloged the laughter, the confessions, the glances shared, and carried it all in quiet patience. And when dawn would come again, golden and alive, the group would awaken, changed. Not in grand gestures, not in words shouted across corridors or fields, but in the subtle, undeniable awareness that they had passed through something larger than themselves, something wild, patient, and ancient had observed them. And in that observation, they had been marked. The plane had brought them here. The triplets had demanded movement, but the land, untamed, eternal, offered lessons they had not anticipated. Stephanie inhaled again, eyes closing briefly, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, the warmth of water on her skin, the quiet weight of connection in every glance and every silence. Angela opened her eyes and laughed softly. "I think I understand now," she said, and for once there was no hesitation, no doubt. Tomiwa smiled. "Me too." Even the palace, distant now, remembered. The wild always remembers. Sunday arrived without asking permission. It came draped in softness, cool air brushing against their skin, pale light spilling over the horizon, and the slow rhythm of a land waking after having witnessed too much to forget. The reserve seemed quieter now, as though it had said all it intended to say and would not repeat itself, its vastness folding around them like a gentle reminder of perspective. They moved through the morning gently. No one mentioned the night. No one explained the glances that lingered too long or the dreams that refused to loosen their grip. Each moment was measured, careful, a dance performed without music. The memory of yesterday hummed beneath their awareness, unacknowledged, yet impossible to ignore. Breakfast was shared beneath an open sky. Steam rose from cups, twisting and curling in delicate spirals before vanishing into the light. Hands brushed over bread, over fruit, over porcelain. Each touch carried weight now, deliberate, cautious, as if even casual contact might ignite something unspoken. Stephanie noticed Thomason watching her, not openly, not possessively, but as though trying to read something newly written on her face. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply observed with the subtle insistence of someone who understood that sometimes the smallest gestures contained the greatest truths. She met his gaze, held it briefly, and then looked away, tracing the rim of her cup instead. A sigh escaped her lips, soft, almost inaudible. The air between them was heavy yet unremarkable, ordinary in its weight, extraordinary in its meaning. Angela laughed at something Grace said, her voice bright but too short. It rang with the echo of the night before, a joy now tempered by awareness. Her laughter faded quicker than usual, leaving a residue of hesitation in the space around her. Tomiwa felt it. He felt the pull, not from fear or distance, but from the edge she had nearly stepped over, the boundary between abandon and restraint. He did not speak, did not comment. Instead, he let the moment exist, silent and delicate, as though naming it would shatter its fragile equilibrium. Elijah stood apart for a moment, observing. He had always been good at reading what people refused to name. What he saw unsettled him, not because it hurt, but because it was inevitable. The traces of connection, the subtle shifts in posture, the brief pauses in conversation, all whispered of boundaries crossed and awareness awakened. Orija felt it too, a sense that something had moved quietly, like a river shifting beneath ice, and would never fully return to its former course. He traced the path of Stephanie's gaze as she moved her cup, noted how Tomiwa's attention lingered on Angela, and understood that the unspoken had claimed more ground than words could ever reach. The flight home was subdued. The private jet carried them across the country, slicing through clouds that glowed pale gold in the morning sun. They sat closer than necessary, yet spoke less. The land fell away beneath them, sweeping plains, rivers curling like veins, but what it had stirred came along, tucked into silence, whispering beneath every polite exchange. Grace broke at once, leaning back in her seat with her usual casual irreverence. "Well," she said lightly, eyes sparkling, "that was unforgettable." Mercy smiled, lips soft and knowing. Some things are meant to stay that way. Her gaze lingered on Angela and Stephanie for just a beat longer than needed, as though she understood the quiet currents swirling between them, between all of them. Love glanced at the Douglas sisters, eyes sharp but kind. "You both look changed," she observed, voice calm but precise. Angela blinked. "Changed how?" Love's smile deepened, subtle and enigmatic, as though something inside you woke up. Stephanie did not deny it. She did not speak. Instead, she let her silence hold meaning, allowing the words to settle without argument or explanation. Lygos greeted them with noise and light. The private jet landed smoothly, the transition abrupt and almost jarring. The city spread beneath them, metallic, pulsing, alive with movement, heat, and possibility. Bamiga Smart stood waiting, tall and composed, his voice carrying a warmth tinged with a British lilt that softened the air around him. even amidst the bustle of the airport. Grace's smile widened, effortless and bright, as she looped her arm through his. "You've arrived just in time," she said lightly, though her eyes carried an unspoken urgency. Introductions were made. Hands were shaken with firm politeness, curiosity exchanged with careful smiles. Small talk flowed, but underneath it, everyone felt the silent tension that had traveled from the reserve, a quiet energy refusing to be dissipated by etiquette. "This time next year," Opemipo said suddenly, as though declaring something already decided, "G&G will be established." Confusion rippled through the group. Grace chuckled, slipping closer to him conspiratorially. "You'll understand soon." Her tone was light, but her eyes glimmered with certainty, as though the world outside the palace and the reserve had its own plans, just as unyielding as the wild. They parted ways at the airport, embraces exchanged, promises made, nothing explained. The words left unsaid carried more weight than those spoken. As the chauffeur drove the remaining four back toward the kingdom, Angela broke the silence. "We didn't drown in the storm," she said quietly, eyes staring out the window at streets waking to the day. Stephanie nodded slowly. "We were swallowed whole." Thomason glanced at her, measured and deliberate. "And," Stephanie met his gaze, steady and unflinching, "and we woke up." No one asked what that meant. They didn't need to. The resonance of experience carried its own understanding, shared between them without articulation. Tomiwa watched Angela in the rearview mirror, noticing the way her jaw had relaxed slightly, the way her fingers brushed the edge of her seat, the subtle ease that had replaced tension. He reached over, covering her hand briefly, grounding her in a touch that needed no words. She didn't flinch. She didn't comment. It was enough. The palace awaited them, sprawling and patient, walls lined with memory and expectation. The drive through its gates was unremarkable to any outsider, yet for them, it carried the weight of what had been stirred. The corridors would hold whispers of laughter and quiet confessions, of glances that lingered, of moments in which nothing had been said but everything had shifted. Stephanie allowed herself a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The events of the past days, Safari, the warmth of the spring, the firelight stories had left marks. They were not scars, not regrets, not declarations, but soft imprints, subtle reminders that even silence could carry power. Angela leaned toward her sister almost imperceptibly, a gesture of solidarity and understanding. "We survived," she murmured. "Not just the land, not just the storm. Everything." Stephanie's lips curved faintly. "Yes, and we remembered." Thomason's presence beside her was steady, protective, yet not imposing. The quiet of the palace walls wrapped around them like an old friend, aware of everything yet never demanding explanation. Tomiwa glanced at Angela once more. "We return different," he said softly. Not as complaint, not as observation, but as acknowledgement of truth. Angela nodded. "Yes, different." The sun dipped low over the kingdom, painting the walls gold. The palace exhaled quietly, ancient and patient, storing the echoes of laughter, the warmth of touch, the unsaid truths that lingered between them. And as the evening settled, each of them carried a secret understanding. The past had been remembered, the present had been tested, the unspoken had been recognized, and it would not be forgotten. They did not speak further that night. They did not need to, for the unspoken had already said everything. The palace received the news before it was spoken aloud. There are places, old places, where walls seem to lean closer when something important approaches. Corridors that had stood silent for decades now felt narrower, their shadows lengthened as though they were listening. The air itself seemed denser, pregnant with expectation, carrying the weight of footsteps not yet taken. That morning, even the sunlight felt deliberate, slipping through high windows in long, careful lines. The maidservant entered the dining hall with a careful calm, her movements precise, her eyes downcast. A sealed letter rested on a silver tray, polished to a faint gleam. The presence of the letter was enough to shift the room's rhythm. Stephanie noticed the seal first. Her fingers itched to reach for it, to break the wax, to see the contents that had already begun to stir the palace into readiness. She did not move. Not yet. Observation was her first act of strategy. Angela noticed the maid's hesitation, the subtle pause. The way her eyes flicked toward Thomason before returning to the tray told Angela more than any words could. The atmosphere was taut, like a bowstring drawn too far, ready to release. Thomason rose, taking the letter without ceremony, his movements measured, controlled. The room seemed to quiet around him, as though the walls themselves acknowledged that a threshold had been crossed. He broke the seal, his fingers deliberate, and read once, then again, slower the second time, tracing each word with a care that belied his usual composure. His expression did not change, at least not visibly. But something in his posture did, a quiet straightening of the spine, a subtle authority settling in, a readiness that had not been there moments before. "They are coming," he said, voice calm, low, carrying weight without raising volume. Angela frowned, confusion knitting her brow. "Who?" Thomason lifted his eyes to meet hers. King Douglas and the Lolo. Silence fell, heavy and deliberate. The air seemed to thicken around them, drawing attention inward to thoughts too complicated for casual speech. "They arrived Friday night," he continued, voice steady. "And they wish to stay one day." Stephanie already knew the rest before it was spoken. She did not need the words. Something in the way the palace had shifted, in the tension that clung to the sunlight, had whispered it to her. "They wish to speak with you," Thomason added gently, "about children." Angela let out a soft breath, a sound caught somewhere between laughter and disbelief. "Already?" Stephanie said nothing. She folded her hands together, the tips of her fingers brushing, a small gesture of control. Her mind raced ahead, calculating, preparing for words not yet spoken, for expectations not yet voiced. "They want to be called grandparents," Thomason finished. That night, the palace prepared itself. Rooms were aired, curtains drawn just so. Linens were changed, fresh and crisp, the scent of lavender lingering faintly in the air. Ritual items, objects of tradition, symbols of lineage, were polished and arranged with precision. The old rhythms returned, the ones that only surfaced when elders returned, when history demanded attention, when bloodlines insisted on recognition. Angela paced her chamber, restless, hands twisting lightly. "Why now?" she asked, more to herself than anyone else. Her voice carried across the high ceilings, bouncing back as a whisper of uncertainty she did not wish to admit aloud. Tomiwa leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching her with an ease that masked concern. "Because time moves, whether we are ready or not," he said simply, tone gentle but firm, as though stating a law rather than offering counsel. She looked at him, searching, weighing his words against her own unease. "And are we?" He crossed the room slowly, deliberately, until he stood close enough to cup her face in his hands. "We will be," he said softly, voice low but resolute, grounding her in a certainty she had not yet felt. Across the hall, Stephanie sat quietly, fingers laced in her lap as Thomason entered. He did not rush. He did not need to. Presence alone carried authority. "They won't ask," she said calmly, eyes following his measured steps. "They'll tell." Thomason nodded. "Yes," he admitted. The acknowledgement was simple, but the weight behind it resonated in the space around them. "And you agree with them?" she asked, steady and unflinching. He hesitated, not long, but honest. "I believe some conversations arrive before desire catches up," he said finally. Stephanie studied him for a moment, the faintest flicker of amusement softening her gaze. Then she smiled faintly, the expression quiet, almost private. "You're learning how to speak gently." He returned the smile, brief and knowing. "You're teaching me." Friday arrived swiftly, almost without ceremony. By nightfall, torches were lit, their flames flickering against the palace walls in reverent rhythm. Drums sounded softly in the distance, respectful, restrained, echoing off stone like distant heartbeats. The king and his Lolo arrived with dignity intact, their presence commanding yet understated, filling the palace without effort or announcement. The Lolo embraced her daughters warmly, hands lingering, eyes tracing familiar faces. There was a softness there, but also the quiet assertion of authority. She lingered just a moment longer than necessary, letting her presence settle over Angela and Stephanie like a touchstone. "You both look radiant," she said, voice smooth, controlled, yet carrying the undercurrent of maternal pride. Angela laughed, light and airy, trying to ease the weight of expectation. "Mother, Lolo," the woman corrected gently, smile unwavering. "Always Lolo." Her eyes sparkled with mischief tempered by experience. The king nodded, satisfaction quiet in his gaze, measured, deliberate. His presence was authority itself, calm, undeniable, tempered by years of observation and duty. The palace closed its doors that night, not in secrecy, but in anticipation. The air shifted subtly as corridors and chambers settled, carrying the scent of polished wood, of candles burning low, of linens newly pressed. Something was about to be set in motion. Something that had been waiting patiently for the moment when past and present could meet in quiet negotiation. Angela sat near a low window, hands clasped loosely in her lap, staring out at the garden bathed in torchlight. "I keep wondering," she said softly, "how much they already know." Stephanie, seated nearby, traced the rim of her cup, fingers cold against porcelain. "It doesn't matter," she replied. "We will speak when it is necessary. The rest is anticipation." Tomiwa leaned casually against the wall, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Anticipation can be its own lesson," he said, "and we are good students." Thomason remained quiet, standing by the fireplace, eyes steady, even in the hush of the palace. His presence conveyed readiness, watchfulness balanced with patience. No one moved without his notice, and yet nothing was forced. Above them, the palace seemed to breathe, ancient and patient, listening to the quiet gathering of hearts and intentions, carrying the knowledge of generations, keeping a record of glances and hesitations, of soft confessions yet to be made. And in the hush of that evening, everyone understood it without saying a word. The arrival of the king and the Lolo was more than ceremony. It was a reminder, a reckoning, a gentle, unyielding force that would set the path ahead. They did not know the details. They did not yet speak of outcomes, but each felt the shift, the delicate weight of expectation, the pull of lineage, the unspoken truth that some things could not be postponed. The palace exhaled quietly around them, aware, patient, certain. And in that awareness, anticipation became a living presence, moving through corridors, tracing the edges of chambers, settling in the spaces between glances, between breaths, and between hearts. Something had been sent. Something had been received. And all of them, Stephanie, Angela, Thomason, Tomiwa, knew that nothing after this could remain untouched by its arrival. Morning arrived gently, as though the palace itself wished to tread softly. The light slipped in across high windows and muted streams, brushing against polished floors, warming the carved wood of the dining table. Even the air seemed to move differently, heavy with history, carrying the memory of generations who had dined, debated, and decided in this very room. Breakfast was served later than usual. The king preferred unhurried mornings, believing that important conversations required calm, and the Lolo had taught him that nothing meaningful could be spoken on an empty stomach. The table was set with tradition in mind. Warm tea, soft breads, and fruit arranged in precise ancestral patterns. Every item seemed chosen not only for sustenance, but to honor what had come before. Angela and Stephanie entered together, skirts brushing lightly against the floor, hair loosely styled, faces composed yet aware. Both felt it, the subtle shift inside the room. Not pressure, not command. Something older, observant. A presence that measured not only posture and speech, but the space between words, the rhythm of breath, the quiet tension that clung to polite smiles. The Lolo watched them closely as they sat, eyes like dark pools, assessing without need for question. She had always been able to read presence as if it were ink on paper, and now she did so with deliberate care. "You carry yourselves differently," she said at last, her voice soft, melodic, yet carrying weight. Stephanie smiled politely. "We've grown." The Lolo nodded, lips pressed lightly together. "Yes, growth leaves traces. Some visible, some hidden, but all real." The The king cleared his throat, folding his hands in front of him with the calm authority that had guided the family for decades. "There are seasons in a family's life," he said, voice low and resonant. "Some announce themselves loudly, with celebration and clamor. Others arrive quietly, almost imperceptibly, and must be recognized rather than demanded." Angela tilted her head, curiosity mingling with caution. "Is this one of those quiet seasons?" The Lolo reached across the table and touched Angela's wrist, fingers light but firm. "Very quiet, very powerful," she said. Her gaze lingered, steady, as if conveying more than words could contain. No one spoke for a moment. The air seemed to pause with them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Each breath held, as though the palace itself was waiting for permission to resume. Then Thomason spoke, carefully, respectfully. "What is it you wish to speak to us about?" The king's gaze moved slowly from his daughters to their husbands. "Legacy," he said simply. The word landed without force, but it did not need to. It settled in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples that touched everyone present. "In our line," the king continued, "children do not arrive by accident, even when they seem to." Stephanie's breath caught, not fear, not excitement, but recognition, as though something deep within her had been waiting for these words, a quiet nod of acknowledgement before her mind had fully registered the meaning. She remained still, lips pressed together, hands folded neatly in her lap. "You have done well," the Lolo said softly, her voice gentle yet insistent. "You married with harmony. You chose with care. Now the next door opens." Angela laughed lightly, attempting to deflect the weight of implication. "Lolo, we haven't even—" The Lolo raised a finger gently, stilling the interruption without harshness. "Child, readiness is not always loud," she said. Her eyes softened only for a heartbeat, and in that brief glance, Angela sensed the depth of what was being conveyed. Not just advice, not just expectation, but knowledge passed down through generations. Quiet, absolute. She stood then, signaling the end of breakfast, and the king followed. "Today," she said, voice calm and commanding, "we rest, we talk, we observe. Some truths ripen only when they are not rushed." That afternoon, the palace slowed. Even the sun seemed to linger in a soft arc, reluctant to move too quickly, as though respecting the gravity of what had been spoken that morning. Angela found herself unusually tired. She sat often, preferring the cool comfort of a chair to walking corridors she usually traversed with ease. Stephanie noticed and mirrored her subtle pauses, observing the patterns, noting the way fatigue mingled with tension. Both dismissed it outwardly as travel, emotion, or residual stress, but the elders had noticed everything. Their presence, even absent now, lingered like a weight that shaped movement. The slightest gesture, the smallest hesitation, was seen and catalogued. Nothing escaped the knowledge carried in the lines of the Lolo's face or the quiet steadiness of the king's posture. By evening, the king and Lolo prepared to retire early, the room dimming in anticipation of their absence. Their steps echoed softly along the polished corridors, leaving behind an invisible order in the air. At the doorway, the Lolo turned back once more, her eyes sweeping the room with deliberate calm. "Whatever unfolds," she said, voice low, measured, "remember, nothing given by lineage is ever empty. Every expectation, every instruction, every blessing carries purpose beyond what is immediately understood." The doors closed behind them with a soft click. Silence followed, not oppressive, but dense, with the awareness of what had been imparted. Angela exhaled slowly, the sound catching somewhere in her chest. "Well, that was unsettling," she said, voice quiet, almost confessional. Stephanie smiled faintly, lips pressed together in a way that suggested both reassurance and acknowledgement. "Or comforting," she replied. Angela looked at her sister, eyes searching. "You felt it too," she said softly, as though confirming a truth that could not be spoken aloud. "Yes," Stephanie admitted, her tone even, thoughtful, like something has already begun. Even if we cannot see it yet, it is already moving inside us. Tomiwa, standing near the doorway, crossed his arms loosely, a quiet observer of the room's shift. Some beginnings, he said, do not announce themselves with noise or spectacle. They arrive with knowing, with recognition, with subtle inevitability. Stephanie nodded, absorbing the weight of the observation. Angela traced her fingers along the edge of the table, thinking of the generations before them, the unspoken threads that bound family together. She realized, in a quiet way, that readiness was less about preparation and more about awareness. Listening, watching, waiting for the proper moment to act. Outside, the moon rose, full and steady, its silver light spilling across the courtyard and into the chambers. The night held a serene authority, as if the earth itself had witnessed the day's revelations and would remember them long after their presence faded. Some beginnings do not announce themselves with fanfare or ceremony. They arrive with knowing, a glance, a touch, a word spoken softly, and in the palace, ancient and patient, they had begun. Night arrived dressed in reverence. The palace lights dimmed not by command, but by instinct, as though the walls themselves had learned when to soften, when to step aside and allow silence to fill the spaces between rooms. Crickets sang outside in layered rhythms, overlapping with the rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle wind. The moon hovered above the ancestral courtyard like an unblinking eye, casting silver across the carved stone, illuminating the patterns worn into the floors by generations of footsteps. Angela stood at her window, palms resting against the cool, polished wood. She felt altered, not ill, not fragile, simply tuned to something beneath her skin, a pull, a vibration that seemed older than her own thoughts. The air smelled faintly of night-blooming flowers, sweet but not cloying, and the scent clung to her senses, anchoring her in a way she couldn't explain. Behind her, Tomiwa watched quietly, leaning against the frame of the doorway, arms crossed loosely. He had learned the language of her silences, long pauses, unspoken shifts in expression, the way she could be present without committing herself to words. "You've been quiet all evening," he said softly, almost afraid to break the fragile spell. Angela smiled without turning. "I don't feel empty enough for words," she replied, voice low, almost conspiratorial. Not hollow, not anxious, just listening. He understood that answer more than he expected. Sometimes, in the spaces between conversation, there was a dialogue far more potent than any syllables could carry. He stepped closer, closing the distance, and rested his hand lightly on the small of her back, careful not to startle. In another wing of the palace, Stephanie sat beside Thomason on the edge of their bed. Neither spoke. Their shoulders touched, a simple contact that carried an unspoken electricity, a language all their own. The moonlight filtered in through the curtains, illuminating the soft curve of Stephanie's profile, highlighting the way her hair fell loosely across her shoulders. Thomason's hand found hers, fingers lacing in quiet solidarity, and he felt the subtle tension in her, the restraint that mirrored his own. "You feel it too," he said at last, voice hushed, reverent. Stephanie nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "Like the air is listening," she whispered, as if saying it aloud might somehow shatter the delicate equilibrium. He took her hand, not possessively, not urgently, but simply there, anchoring her, acknowledging without pressing, offering presence as a gift. Outside, the wind moved through the palm trees lining the courtyard, carrying with it whispers older than language, brushing across the walls and threading into the chambers. The palace itself seemed to breathe with them, attuned to a rhythm no clock measured, one older than floors or ceilings. At midnight, the palace clock chimed once. Not loud, not ceremonial, just enough to mark a moment, to acknowledge the passage of time without commanding attention. Angela closed her eyes as warmth spread through her, not desire exactly, but a pull, a gravity that felt chosen, inherited, inevitable. She felt the quiet weight of lineage, of expectation, and yet, for once, it did not oppress her. It hummed beneath the skin, gentle, persistent. Tomiwa stepped closer, resting his forehead lightly against hers, the heat of his skin grounding her in the present. "We don't have to name it," he murmured, the words soft but deliberate. She smiled, eyes still closed. "Good. I don't think it wants a name yet." They lay together in stillness, bodies aligned, breaths sinking, a rhythm that required no speech. The moment was not about urgency, not about the demands of the world outside the palace walls. It was about intention, a quiet force that seeps slowly into the marrow, into memory, into something deeper than habit or routine. Elsewhere, Stephanie rested her head against Thomason's chest, listening to the slow, steady cadence of his heartbeats. Each beat spoke of certainty, of presence, of a promise neither needed to articulate. She could feel it, like a low hum vibrating through the floorboards, through the air, through her own body. "Do you believe in timing?" she asked softly, almost rhetorically. The question lingering between them like smoke curling in the moonlight. "I believe in listening when it arrives," he replied, voice calm, measured. "Even if it comes quietly, even if it does not announce itself." Then they held each other as though holding the outline of a future yet to come, each aware of the unspoken connections threading through the room, the palace, the world beyond these walls. The night passed gently. No thunder, no declarations, no loud awakenings, just alignment. The kind of alignment that, once acknowledged, changes the space around it irrevocably. Outside, the moon moved slowly across the sky, reflecting off the stone and metal of the palace. Shadows stretched and shifted with imperceptible grace, folding over one another like thoughts forming quietly in the mind. Somewhere, the scent of jasmine drifted faintly through the open windows, a perfume that carried memory, anticipation, and a strange, almost sacred expectation. Angela shifted slightly, leaning against Tomiwa, feeling the slow rise and fall of his chest, the strength of his presence against her own. She did not speak. There was nothing to say. The words would come, perhaps when the moment required them. For now, this perfect, unarticulated understanding was enough. Stephanie too rested in silence, the cool weight of Thomason beside her, grounding every thought, every pulse. Her mind traced the line of the future they had yet to encounter, and instead of fear or hesitation, she felt a quiet certainty. The palace seemed to hum with approval. The walls, the floors, the heavy curtains, the ancestral portraits watching silently from above. They all bore witness, silent observers, to a moment that could not be interrupted, could not be rushed. When dawn finally approached, it did not feel like an ending. Light seeped into the chamber slowly, brushing across faces, spilling over fingertips, spilling onto the floors in a soft, golden haze. It felt more like confirmation than arrival, an acknowledgement that what had begun in silence, in trust, in measured intention, was now quietly set into motion. Angela opened her eyes first, meeting Tomiwa's gaze across the thin curtain of shadows. "It feels right," she murmured, voice low, reflective, almost reverent. "It does," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face, as though nothing before tonight mattered except this. "Except us." Stephanie followed shortly, lifting her head from Thomason's chest. She allowed herself a small, serene smile. "Timing," she said softly, echoing her earlier question, "is less about calendars and more about awareness." Thomason nodded, holding her hand just a little longer. "And listening. Always listening." The palace exhaled as morning arrived, and in that exhale there was both a release and a promise. Some beginnings do not announce themselves with fanfare, with noise, or with spectacle. They arrive in moments so delicate they are almost invisible. Yet once they have passed, everything that follows is altered. The quiet before midnight had ended. And somewhere deep within the palace, within the walls, the lineage, the futures not yet visible, something settled into place. The light of dawn was not the end. It was confirmation.